Good morning, everyone. I am Alan Pike, chair of the board for the Roseburg Area Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, and thank you for joining us virtually today for our Economic Forecast 2021 program. This year's presenters will provide insight and information into the economic trends we're seeing in Douglas County, Oregon, and our country, highlight the particular impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, civil discord, devastating wildfires, and, of course, the politics of our most recent election cycle. 2020 has been quite a year. The impacts to our economy go without saying, and it is certain the impact will be felt into 2021 and beyond. We are fortunate to have three distinguished presenters who will shed some light on the economy, where we've been, and where we're going. Before we get started, I must recognize and thank our generous member sponsors for today's program. Adcox Heating Center, Bowers Industrial Incorporated, Gordon Wood Insurance, Lone Rock Resources, Roseburg Forest Products, and Umpqua Bank. Thank you, sponsors. Our first speaker this morning was scheduled to be John Tapogna with ECONorthwest. John was called away to other business last minute, but thankfully, Robert Whelan is able to join us this morning. Robert has been a senior economist at ECONorthwest for 24 years. He works for a broad range of clients and industries where he incorporates market research, financial feasibility analysis, strategic planning into traditional economic analysis. Before joining ECONorthwest, Mr. Whelan was a mineral economist for the state of Oregon, a director of strategic planning for a major mining company, a manager of market research for a multinational materials company, and an economic consultant for Chase Bank. Please join me in welcoming Robert Whelan, and as a reminder, we will be taking questions via chat. So if you have those, please go ahead and send those, and then I will read those to our presenters during the Q&A portion if it's something that they have not already covered. So I am going to go ahead and unmute Mr. Whelan here and make it so we can all see him. And there we go.
Oh, there I am. Well, thank you, Alan, and good morning, everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you all. And you know, economic outlook presentations usually start with someone saying, well, these are uncertain times. You know, you hear this often. But you think about it, when are times certain? But usually what economists do is, while there's uncertainty, there's nothing dramatic going on like we have now. And so economists can get away with forecasting by showing some charts, showing some recent trends, looking at old data, throwing in a few crazy formulas. But that's not going to work today. And let me tell you why. I want to go back to my first job, working for Chase in the late 70s. This firm was started by an economist at the University of Pennsylvania, built the first macroeconomic model in the United States. And my employer, Chase, bought the firm. And the model was this big number crunching affair. Still exists. In fact, the state of Oregon and hundreds of others still use the output of this model today. Over the years, though, I've realized that economic forecasts as a whole are pretty awful. They're designed mathematically to forecast averages. And so, you know, the economy grows a little bit each quarter. And if you ever look at forecasts, they often look like they are practically straight lines, trend lines. And also, economists add to the problem because there's this behavior where no one wants to be outside of the pack. Because if your forecast is outside of the pack, everybody's going to remember. And if it's wrong, you're in trouble. If you're with the pack and the whole pack is wrong, you're not in trouble. You just say, well, everybody thought it. So as a result, economic forecasts and outlooks tend to be strikingly similar and most often strikingly pretty awful. But people buy these forecasts. And I always wondered why. And I realize it's not because they're sure they're right, mostly because they just want to quell their discomfort facing uncertainty. Because one thing I've learned in doing research in economics is just basically through human evolution, people detest uncertainty. It makes them anxious. It especially bothers them if that uncertainty will determine whether or not they'll have a paycheck or be able to pay their rent. So about 3 years ago at ECHO, I started writing economic outlooks that focused more on human behavior, psychology, infrequent but big historical factors that economic models just simply miss. So let me start off. I'm going to give you a quote. This was in Barron's this week. It was a good quote about the economic outlook. And it was from Kierkegaard. And he said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." And economists try to look forward by looking backward, and that's fine. Often that works. But they do so by relying too heavily on statistics and data, limited data, by the way. And that's a problem, a real big problem. And I'm trying to get away from that today. So what I'm going to do is tell you my economic outlook, and I will look at the past, but do it without using a lot of math and numbers, which this early in the morning is probably a relief to you all. And I'm going to rely a little bit more on theory and behavior. And with that, let's start with where we are now. Here's the situation. We're in the worst recession probably since the Depression. But the third quarter was actually up a lot. However, this is the problem. It was up because people and businesses that have money were buying durable goods, things like computers, trucks, pickup trucks, hard to find, appliances, stuff that lasts. The problem is that once you buy these things, you're not going to buy another one the next quarter. So durable goods purchasing kind of dwindles. Meanwhile, services spending fell in the third quarter. In fact, this is the first recession I know of which has been led by a decline in demand for services, things like hotel stays, dry cleaning, restaurant meals, seeing shows, shopping at stores, all down. And that's important because services are 60% of the economy, 80% of all the jobs, so it matters. Now, many working in affected service businesses are not feeling recession today, they're feeling depression. Yet at the same time, other parts of the economy are fine. Many of us, including me, can work at home, earn money, while many of my neighbors lost their jobs, saw their incomes plummet. We're going to have trouble coming up with the mortgage money. Meanwhile, the rest of us continue to earn money, but we don't have places to spend it because of COVID. So what's happening? We're saving it, building up savings. Average it all out. And savings are rising at record levels, while the US economy is running about 5% below where it should be. So averages don't really tell the whole story. Whether you know there's a recession or not really depends literally on what kind of industry you work in. The haves are happier. The have-nots are growing angry. It's fueling social schism, and this is a problem. So here's what I mean. Let's see what the government's done. Initially, the president and Congress got together and did a big fiscal package. Unemployment benefits were enhanced. The PPP program, they gave money to the airline industry. Now, there was some skullduggery. Anytime government hands out checks, there's some bad things happen. But for the most part, it worked. And you know how we know? Well, the economy grew in the third quarter, and unemployment came down. That's fiscal policy. On the other side is monetary policy done by the Federal Reserve Bank. They're in charge of lending money, setting the money supply, regulating banks, overseeing credit markets. Very important. So what did they do? Well, in March and April, they unfroze the mortgage and the municipal bond markets. They also started helping the corporate bond market. They literally were out buying for the first time corporate bonds. And that lifted the stock market. Almost overnight, the stock market went up. They also pumped $3 trillion by creating cash into the economy. $3 trillion since February. It's an unprecedented amount. So asset prices rose. Home prices reversed their decline almost overnight. There are now bidding wars for homes. Stock prices took off. This during a recession. Kind of doesn't make sense. But here's the rub. All those Fed efforts did mostly to cause asset prices to go up. They inflated them. But it actually didn't do much to stimulate the economy. It didn't really create jobs, which is why things aren't looking good now. And worse, asset price inflation, while it helped people with savings, because savings are assets, hurt people who have little or no savings, people that don't own a house, people that don't own stock. Consider young people, like some of the people I work with. They're kids in their 20s and 30s, early in their careers. They don't have a lot of savings. A lot of them have student loans. They were made worse off by asset inflation. If they wanted to buy a house, they'd have trouble finding one. Home prices become unaffordable. That's the downside of asset price inflation. On the flip side, in sectors which held up and people kept their jobs, or people that could work at home, they benefited. They have a lot of money to spend on housing. Now, the Fed's action, they caused mortgage rates to drop. So what did people do? People in that, with all those savings and maybe living in the cities, decided, well, I'm got to work at home. We're crammed here. Let's buy a house in the suburbs, even in some ex-urban areas, because I don't have to commute. And so housing demand in the suburbs skyrocketed. The other people that stayed home, that stayed in houses, exhibited something we always see in major crisis periods. It's called nesting behavior. I wrote about this back in April. Nesting behavior is people tend to focus for security reasons, for a sense of security. When something is uncontrollable out there, like COVID, and there's fear, they deal with it by fixing up their homes. So they went to Home Depot. They spent money on home improvements. They bought appliances. Demand for lumber rose. Prices of lumber just reversed, went up, tripled in a short period of time. There are other forms of nesting behavior, a lot more home cooking, which is why you couldn't find flour at stores, or brands. People gravitate to traditional brands, what's in their memory. So Campbell's soup became a hot item, right? And Kraft Foods, I think COVID saved Kraft Foods Company. Manufacturers of brands, like the cookie manufacturer that produces Oreos, which every 3 months would come out with a new flavor, ditched the new flavors because they knew they wouldn't sell, just the traditional secure flavors. So all this action by the Fed helped many, but probably hurt people that are not well off to begin with. So economists would call this kind of a market distortion. $3 trillion one, by the way, which is a huge quantity. It exacerbated inequality, and that's not good for society. That's what's happening. That explains maybe the election, some of the social unrest. Now let me turn to what's happening in Douglas County. One of the interesting things that came out of COVID pandemic is that the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank figured out a way to take all the mobile phone data, all the cell phone data that measures locations, crunch it, and determine how much people are getting out. It's called the Mobility and Engagement Index, and they actually make one for Douglas County. So what they do is they basically tracking, are people going to businesses? Are they going to stores? Are they going to schools? Are they going from home? Are they traveling in Douglas County? And they compare all the cell phone movements inside your county every day and compare it to the same day in past years. Is it up or down? Basically, it tells you if people are getting out more, if they're doing more things, and all this is highly correlated to economic activity. And here's what we found. Before COVID hit, the mobility and engagement index bounced around 0, plus or minus a few points. It averaged +2, which is normal. It means the economy is growing, not gangbusters, but it was growing pretty good. Then COVID hit. Governor Brown issues this stay-at-home order, and the index plunged dramatically. In the third week of March, it started to go down. By the first week in April, it was -55, extraordinarily bad. After that, it started to recover, not all the way, but by August, it was -13. Still down, but far better than it was. Then we got hit in Douglas County with wildfires. And it plunged again. It ended up down about -31 at the worst point in September 12th. After the wildfires, and that we got lucky with some rain, in October, it started to go back up, and it was -12. And things look okay, not great, but okay. Better off than we had been. But where are we now in Douglas County? Well, it's trending down. Last week, the index was -24. And we're seeing this decline throughout the state and throughout the country. People are cutting back on going out, engaging, and spending. And it's a trend, and it's pretty substantial. By the way, this index is much worse in cities. At Portland, it's -45. But that's because a lot of the jobs in Portland are office jobs. I live downtown, and I have to tell you, downtown is a ghost town because all the offices are closed. All the small businesses depend on those office workers. Portland State has no students. We depend on that. And so the mobility and engagement in downtown is terrible. Here's something, though, that was really interesting to me. I was wondering what happened in states that opened up. Remember Georgia? We're just going to open up the economy. And Texas, Florida, they all did the same thing. Here's the weirdest thing. The mobility and engagement index in those states went up and then went right back down. It's actually lower in those states than it is in Oregon. And this tells me something. It tells me regardless of how governors respond to COVID, it's people that determine whether they're going to go out and engage. Governors matter little. They cannot turn their economies around by demanding people spend. It's not government edicts that determine what people will do. It's what people can control. And when there's tremendous uncertainty and fear, people gravitate to anything they can control. It gives them comfort. And even if what they're trying to control is an illusion, they'll do it. And what can you control? Well, you can control whether or not you go to work sometimes. You can control whether your kids go to that school, whether you go out and spend. And people have pulled back. So this is all rather depressing. And I don't mean to depress you, but going back to where I started, I do like to look at history and behaviors because history repeats itself. And what I found is really good news. So I look back at the two last real big pandemics, ones that killed more than 1 million people and spread throughout the world. They're actually really, really rare. The two most notable are Black Plague and the Spanish flu. So I looked at what people did during those times, how they reacted, and what happened after they were over. So for some background, a little history, Black Plague started in Europe around 1347. It was the Middle Ages. It killed between a quarter and a half of the population. And like COVID, there were no cures at the time, there were no vaccines, there were no treatments. When it came to Venice, which was the big city, people initially ignored it. It's like people ignored it for quite a while, but some people panicked. But most people were in the middle, and they instinctively started social distancing. In fact, the word quarantine is from the Venetian language. It means 40 days. What they did in Venice was when a sailor came into port, they would make them stay in isolation for 40 days before they were allowed in the general public. The city restricted businesses. They imposed travel restrictions. People started doing hand washing. They didn't know about infections like we do today, but they instinctively know these things. And cremations replaced burials, which had a big effect. These are called non-drug interventions, and they worked. The bulk of the deaths in Venice happened in a 9-month period, and then the disease dissipated. So while the Black Plague, when you look at the history charts, goes on for like 5 years, the truth is in any one area which did these interventions, it didn't last a year. Other parts of Europe, including southern Italy, that didn't use them very much, the disease ravaged the population. Instead, many tried worthless cures and treatments like flagellation, people were hitting themselves with leather straps to get rid of the virus. And recall that COVID, we had similar treatments that weren't going to work. Hydrochloroquine was designed for malaria and killing an amoeba site. COVID is a virus. It's not an antiviral. It didn't work. It killed some people. Later, remdesivir came out. And this is an interesting one. That was really pushed by the manufacturer, Gilead Research. It's been proven not to work. So the other pandemic I looked at was Spanish flu. Similar things happened. First appeared in America in the spring of 1918. And by the way, it started in Kansas, not Spain. And Spanish called it the French flu. It's part of the blame game. That probably sounds familiar to you all. How we name these viruses to blame someone else. History repeats itself. At first, the Spanish flu was mild. People didn't pay much attention to it. Then in October, the first death happened in Oregon. Eventually, it killed about 5% of those infected, and most of them were under the age of 40. 675,000 lives were lost nationwide. The news was bad. For instance, Coos Bay ran out of child-sized coffins. That was a headliner. Panic ensued. People reacted in Oregon in particular, but other parts of the country, with non-drug interventions. Mask use became common. Quarantining happened. All the schools in Oregon were closed. Social gatherings were banned. Portland even took the windows off of the streetcars so there'd be fresh airflow. And like the plague and today's COVID, unfounded cures came up. And what was the big unfounded cure for Spanish flu? High doses of aspirin. People ate so much aspirin that aspirin poisoning killed people. And Bayer, the manufacturer, really made no effort to stop that misuse. That should sound familiar. So interventions worked. It took about 9 months, and Spanish flu was mostly over. And by the way, Oregon had one of the lowest death rates in the nation. I think it's because of the state has a high compliance rate because of the community culture we have. By the way, today, in COVID, Oregon has the 5th fewest cases per capita. 1.3% of the population has had COVID, including one of my sons. North Dakota, on the other hand, has the highest. 7.5% of North Dakotans have had COVID. They did little social distancing despite the pleas of the governor. Again, governors can speak, but public has to listen. And in a few days, total deaths from COVID in North Dakota will exceed Oregon, even though Oregon has 6 times as many people. In both pandemics, Black Plague and the Spanish flu, people moved out of cities. And we're seeing this here. Demand for suburban housing around Portland is crazy right now. Ex-urban housing is up too, although less so because of families with kids value the quality of the schools, and the schools are better closer to Portland than they are in the ex-urban areas. So most of that movement is now just going to the suburbs to larger homes. And will this trend continue once COVID ends? Human behaviorist history says no, although demand for suburban housing is always going to be rising. Now let's talk about the future. What's going to happen next? Because history has been a guide of what has happened so far, pretty good guide. And first of all, epidemics rarely last more than 3 years, and COVID will end. And with the president's effort at Operation Warp Speed, we'll have vaccines in record time. It's absolutely amazing to me. So this could all be over in the summer. And that's not just hope talking. I think it's likely. After Black Plague, this is what happened there. Labor became scarce. Wages rose. So did living standards for millions of people. And people began moving to where the jobs were. There was mobility. It used to be people born, lived, and died in the city they were born and never left. They started accumulating wealth, building savings. Common people were able to buy land. So feudalism ended. The church lost power as people questioned authority, eventually leading to the Protestant Reformation. Individual freedom and creativity thrived. Science, the arts, and engineering flourished. Labor-saving equipment was invented, like plows, and 40 years later, the printing press. Historians say the plague was largely responsible for the Renaissance. The European economy boomed. Now you look at the Spanish flu. Interesting comparison. After the Spanish flu, mobility increased tremendously. Travel, social interaction grew. Live entertainment industry skyrocketed with large audiences looking to spend money. Living standards improved. Individual freedom and creativity thrived. It was an unprecedented time of wealth growth and income growth, wage growth, innovation, and change in our country. And historians say that pandemic played a major role in shaping the roaring 20s. So think about this. COVID caused a demand shock. Demand for services plunged. The disease continued longer than most of us expected. So a lot of businesses folded, abandoned. But a year from now, with COVID nearly gone, there will be a surge in demand from savers who are itching to spend and get out and socialize. Places to do things will be in short supply. There won't be, Portland's losing half its restaurants. So the restaurants that make it are going to be packed. Prices will go up a lot, but that's not necessarily bad, particularly if you're a surviving business. This will create, and I mean will create, I'm not uncertain about this, an economy with all the elements for rapid growth. We will have excess skilled labor, lots of vacant, cheap, and desirable commercial space and land, equipment and supplies plenty, super low interest rates, ample savings to tap, a paucity of competitors. You open up a new restaurant and your competitor that was there 3 years ago is gone. And lots of customers wanting to spend their excess savings. It's no different than what happened in Venice in the mid-1490s or in America in the 1920s. So hands down, 2022 and maybe even 2021 or parts of it, could be the best years in decades for entrepreneurs to start businesses. The success rate of new businesses starting in deep recessions historically has always been highest. But this time you have the added driver of having more than half the households whose finances actually improved during this recession. Most recessions, that doesn't happen. And they want to spend, they're able to spend. They are going to be spending on travel, restaurants, performing arts, town and city housing, gadgets and services, social gatherings like fairs, sporting events. The economy is going to flourish. And I'm certain of this. I know it will happen. So I hope you feel better, and thank you for inviting me and listening to my rant. Alan?
So yeah, thank you very much, Bob. Appreciate that. We do have a couple questions. I guess specifically, as it relates, again, love the outlook for the future. That is definitely encouraging, and that's related to this question. It is basically with policy like the payroll protection program that essentially, again, is helping with both keeping employees on as well as keeping businesses that might otherwise go under afloat. Looking at the possibility or the potential of an economic rebound, is that something that as a policy makes sense to do again? I know that there's been discussion and stuff about that on the national level, and who knows what's going to happen there, but is that something where the more businesses that stay afloat during this time are likely to succeed when when things do begin to rebound?
Well, whether or not Congress and the new president sign off on another version of the payroll protection program, I think it was Marco Rubio, the Republican senator in Florida, who did most of the work on that. And for a rush job, it was a good job. The thing you have to always remember, and Americans often don't think of it, don't realize this, is the federal government, while you may think it's really, really, really big, it's not. It's maybe, 15% of the economy. So their ability to pay for, $3 trillion programs is limited. The private sector dominates the economy. So that's something to consider. So if there is something else, and I suspect there will be, Mitch McConnell said he's interested, and Joe Biden will sign off on any of these. I think there'll be something, but it won't be as generous, and they might be a little more careful. Because some industries got, screwed. Entertainment industry got screwed, big time. I'm sure you got museums and theaters down there, performing arts theaters. You have probably musicians that are dying for work. They got nothing, but American Airlines got money, a lot of it. So there's going to be some jockeying around for that. I think they will, but it could turn around much faster than you think. The problem is that you got a big chunk of the labor force in households that have been kicked down. A lot of middle-class people who are now low income. They're in poverty for the first time. You're going to see a lot of homelessness. And I personally have been homeless. It's not a pleasant thing. I feel for those people, and hopefully we can do something to help them. In Portland, homelessness is becoming crazy. And this is a town where a 3-bedroom apartment is $3,500 a month.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. So I tried to combine those two questions into one. So I think thank you for your answer there. I appreciate it. And again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. More than welcome, Alan.
All right. So next, we'll hear from Oregon Employment Department Regional Economist, Brian Rooney. Now, this is the first time I've attended an economic forecast event where Brian has spoken, but I hear from past attendees that he is a fan favorite. Mr. Rooney has been employed with the Oregon Employment Department for the past 23 years, first as a workforce analyst, and now as a regional economist stationed in Eugene. Prior to the Oregon Employment Department, Mr. Rooney worked as an analyst for ICF International, an engineering and economics consulting firm. Mr. Rooney is responsible for covering the economic conditions of Douglas County and Lane County. His duties include making estimates of current employment by industry and contributing to the estimate of unemployment rates. He also produces and or distributes a wide variety of additional economic information, including industry employment forecasts, wage and income data, and demographic statistics. Mr. Rooney is a graduate of Oregon State University with a master's degree in economics and of George Washington University with a bachelor's degree in economics. Please join me in welcoming back Mr. Brian Rooney. And as we welcome back Mr. Rooney, I will go ahead and get this PowerPoint presentation set here. And we're going to go ahead and get Mr. Rooney set. And there is that. Please bear with me as we get this set here. And one more moment. All right, and in just a moment, you should see that forecast slideshow on the screen. And there we go, Mr. Rooney, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Robert. That was a great overview of how economists look at the present and look at what's relevant in the past and apply it to the future. That was a great overview. Robert was also kind enough not to expose us to a lot of math and graphs early in the morning. I'm afraid I'm not going to be that kind. As you can see, I'm a regional economist for the Employment Department. And so I'm a labor economist, and I'm going to talk about employment and unemployment during a pandemic. We have some data on how the fires affected employment. And then we have a forecast. It's a long-term forecast, 10-year forecast that we recently published, and I'm going to go over that quickly towards the end. I guess, Alan, you're going to be advancing the slides. Okay, so employment and unemployment during a pandemic. Next. Okay, so this is long-term employment, payroll employment in Douglas County. And it's not seasonally adjusted. This is the most recent, most solid data we have, and it's not seasonally adjusted, and that's why it's all squiggly. But if you look at the recessionary periods, they really stand out. So if we look all the way to the right, we can see how the pandemic is playing out in Douglas County. Douglas County lost, let me see, I can't see my own notes here. Lost a little over 3,800 jobs between February and April. So those jobs were lost because of the restrictions from COVID-19. That was about 10% of employment in Douglas County. Then between April and June, the county had gained back about 70% of the employment lost. So initially, we saw a fast rebound as restrictions were lifted and some businesses were allowed to open back up. Statewide, Oregon lost about 13% of its jobs between February and April and had gained back about 40% of what it had lost by June. So Douglas County was a little less affected and had a little faster rebound than the rest of the state. Urban areas, and especially areas that depend on tourism and have a high concentration of jobs in restaurants and hotels, like the North Coast, were affected much more harshly. Next. Okay, so this graph is shows on the industry level jobs that were lost between February and April. That's the blue, and then the red are the jobs gained back April to June. So if we just start at the top, the goods producing industries were not hurt as badly. So mining and logging had a little bit of a loss, but then just came right back and grew as they normally do during the late spring and summer. Construction, not hurt all that bad, and gained back most of its jobs. So these are jobs where you pretty much naturally practice social distancing. A lot of the construction, large construction jobs, single family home, that's mostly done outside. And so it's no problem practicing social distancing. So they weren't that badly affected. Manufacturing had some losses, gained back a lot of the jobs lost there. In manufacturing, there were two things going on. Some manufacturing, you can't practice social distancing very well, but also in manufacturing, there was a drop in demand, and that contributed to some of the job loss. Wholesale trade hardly affected at all. Retail trade was affected at first, but came back strongly. And in fact, grocery stores added some jobs during the early parts of the pandemic, during the restrictions, because they needed help for people who were picking up groceries. And then, we go down through transportation, information, and financial activities. These are either essential jobs like transportation and utilities, or jobs you can do at home. A lot of the information jobs and financial activities jobs, you can do them at home. So they were barely affected. But then we get down to some of the services, professional and business services. A lot of that's the temporary firms. They were hit pretty hard and haven't gained back all of their jobs. The temporary firms are kind of an indication of the overall economy. So they were hit pretty hard during that period. Private education and health services. That's mostly health services. A lot of health services really just had a shutdown in April. And a lot of them started coming back, doctor's offices, dentist offices, when they could set up social distancing in their offices. So they came back at a lower level than they were operating at before the pandemic. Hospitals also sent some people home. Elective surgery was cut out, and some other things were cut out so that the hospitals could concentrate on COVID. So that industry was hit pretty hard and is come back somewhat, still down a couple of hundred. Leisure and hospitality obviously was affected most by the restrictions. That's restaurants and hotels. In Douglas County, though, that came back pretty substantially considering the restrictions that were put on restaurants. Still down a couple of hundred, though. And it's kind of interesting, going into the winter, a lot of restaurants were able to stay afloat in the summer because they set up outdoor dining. They may not be able to do that so much in the winter, so they're kind of forced to see less business. So we're kind of watching restaurants this winter to see how they'll do. Other services, hairdressers were in there. They're kind of like doctor's offices. They had to shut down for a while, but were able to set up their places of business for social distancing, and were able to come back at a lesser level. In government, that's mostly local education. So local education, pretty much shut down except for virtual learning in April. And then they went into their summer break and continued to decline. We're not expecting to see local education come back fully, get back to base employment. The the employment that they had before the pandemic. We're not expecting to see that happen until we get back to kind of the new normal where kids can be back in class and they can take the bus and all the services that happen at schools are back up to full capacity. Next. Okay, so those were the solid numbers, the payroll employment numbers that we have. Beyond that, we do estimates, and the estimates go through September. And the latest estimates for Douglas County, and really the state and the country, show that after a rapid rebound, employment growth is continuing, but at a slower rate. So what this graph is showing is the blue line is the Great Recession, and it's indexed to 0, and on the bottom axis, you have months since the start of the recession. So the red line is what we're currently going through, and you can see that big drop and then the big recovery, but after that, things are slowing down. The employment growth is slowing down. The folks at the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis have dubbed this the square root recovery. So it's not exactly a V recovery, it's not exactly a U recovery like the Great Recession was, but they're calling it the square root recovery because, like that red line, the recovery we're going through looks somewhat like a square root sign. Next. So this is a short-term forecast from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis, and you can see that square root recovery. Their latest forecast is a big improvement from their initial forecast. So the dark red line is the current forecast, and you can see that square root sign shape. The dark line is the Great Recession. So when we look at the Great Recession, it took 7 years to get back to base employment, the employment that we started at before the recession. This one, they're forecasting about 3 years. So that kind of goes along with what Robert was talking about, a rather rapid recovery once we get going. But even though there's a rapid recovery initially, there is some permanent damage to the economy, and that's going to take a couple of years to work out. At least that's what the forecast is saying. By the way, this is statewide, but the general idea applies to most areas of the state. Next. These are unemployment rates, the Oregon and Douglas County unemployment rates, and as you'd expect, it's the inverse of employment. Employment goes down and unemployment goes up. It's kind of fascinating that we were working on record low unemployment before April. Douglas County hit a record low of 4.1% unemployment rate in December of 2019. And between December and April, we were just kind of bouncing along at this record low between 4.1 and 4.3%. Then with the COVID restrictions, skyrocketed to 16.2%. That 16.2% is close to a record, but it isn't the record for Douglas County. The record occurred in April of 2009 at 16.9%. So we got close. We're seeing unemployment rates that are reminiscent of the Great Recession. But believe it or not, the 16.2 is not a record. Currently, September, Douglas County is at 7.9%. And that's the 16th highest seasonally adjusted county rate in the state. Historically, Douglas County is a little higher, somewhere between the 10th to 5th highest unemployment rate in the state. But currently, we're on par with the statewide rate of 8% and the national rate of 7.9%. Next. Okay, so here is a look at the reasons for unemployment. the reasons for the job losses. So if we look at the blue line, those are temporary layoffs. That's a layoff where an employer says, yeah, you're going to be coming back. And that's the vast majority, at least early on in this recession, were temporary layoffs. The green line is permanent layoffs. And if you look back at the Great Recession, that was characterized by permanent layoffs. We look at permanent layoffs in the latest numbers, we can kind of see that a lot of people who were temporarily unemployed have come back to work, but we're starting to see an uptick in permanent unemployment. So, you know, eventually, a lot of those temporary layoffs are going to become permanent. We've also heard from employers, they're wondering why they're having a hard time finding people when the unemployment rate is high. Part of the reason is that a lot of the layoffs are temporary. There are a lot of other reasons to stay home during a pandemic. You know, kids are out of school, there's childcare problems. People don't necessarily want to risk their lives, getting back out in the workforce. But that temporary unemployment is probably the biggest reason. If you don't have to take a job and you have a job waiting for you at some point in the future, you're probably going to stay at home. Next. Okay, this is September unemployment rates by county. And, what we're seeing is that a lot of the rural areas did better than, say, urban areas during the pandemic and even to this day. So it's kind of a switch. You know, in the past, we had seen higher unemployment rates out there in Eastern Oregon and lower in the urban areas and in Western Oregon. Currently, we're seeing some of the lowest unemployment rates out in Eastern Oregon, you know, because it's agriculture, logging, some manufacturing, industries that aren't affected by the COVID restrictions as much. So we can see Multnomah County has a high rate of 9.5%. Medford has a relatively high rate. And then on the coast and in the Bend area, these are areas that are more dependent on tourism and that leisure and hospitality industry. So they're seeing higher rates of unemployment also. Next. Okay, so we have some limited data on September's fires' effect on employment. And let's take a look. Next. All right, so this is a data dump. And so here's your early morning data dump. What we're looking at here is the number of businesses, establishments, and the number of jobs in evacuation zones during these 2 weeks in September. So September 11th is the top one. The bottom set two graphs or tables are September 17th. So if we look at September 11th, Douglas County had 75 businesses that were in evacuation zones and 614 jobs in those evacuation zones. But most of them were in level 3 evacuation zones. So that means, you know, clear out. Clackamas County had the most businesses and employment in evacuation zones during that day. So it was 165,000, almost 166,000 jobs in evacuation zones on September 11th in Clackamas County. So the great majority of them, though, were in level 1, but still there were over 10,000 in level 3. And that's one thing about these fires, at least statewide. A lot of times these fires are, you know, out in the hills, out away from population and commercial centers. These fires were coming down out of the Cascades, headed towards Western Oregon, and in some cases got into towns and commercial areas. So they affected employment a little more than some of the big fires we've seen in the past. If we go to September 17th, for Douglas County, it got a little better. There were 62 businesses in evacuation zones, 476 jobs, but most of them were in level 1 during that second week. Jackson County down near Medford, or that's where the county where Medford is, had the most that week. And that was 7,872 businesses and over 90,000 jobs. But in that instance, most of the jobs were in level 1. So, you know, these fires, as I said before, got into some population areas and some commercial areas and caused some damage. Next. Okay, usually try not to talk too much, practice too much conjecture, but I kind of wanted to put out some of the thoughts that I've heard from people, you know, just in meetings and talking to other economists, business folks, what's been going on out there because of the fires. So some of the negatives, obviously, the loss of homes, businesses, jobs, the trauma, you know, in some cases, death. That's a big negative. But in the future, it could be detrimental to tourism in several areas, including Douglas County. A lot of people travel to Oregon, you know, to be in the forest, and you probably don't want to be visiting a burned out forest. Could reduce population and business migration in the future. If people and businesses think that Oregon is a more risky place to move to, they may think twice. They may not move to Oregon because they think it's more risky than their other options. Timber harvest levels may be reduced, and I guess that depends where the fires were and what kind of usage that forest was having. Some of the positives, first of all, disasters like this create increased construction activity from rebuilding. You know, it's kind of like a hurricane. When I lived back east, I worked for a construction company, and a lot of people went down to South Carolina after Hugo because there was a lot of demand for rebuilding. There was some federal money there to do it. So they were getting paid a premium to go down to South Carolina and help with the rebuilding. And also there's the possibility of increased logging through salvage. So we'll see how the logging goes, but some folks are talking about the salvage logging. Obviously the negatives outweigh the positives. You know, we wish that it never happened, but there may be a few positives that come out of it. Next. Okay, so this is our employment forecast. We started the forecast and we almost had it done early in the year, but then the COVID restrictions hit, and you know we'd be remiss to totally ignore them. So we went back and we did some adjustment. This is a 10-year forecast, and they're designed to capture structural changes that affect industries and occupations over the long haul. But after COVID happened, we went back and we adjusted some of the industries that were most affected by COVID. So we didn't really try and capture some of the long-term effects of the COVID pandemic. You know, for instance, it's expected that more people are going to work from home after the pandemic. We're not quite sure how that's going to affect industries and occupations. So we didn't attempt to do that, but we did adjust some of the industries that were most affected. You know, it took a little growth off of them. So some of the short-term effects are accounted for. So next. So first of all, statewide, we're expecting 9% growth over the 10-year period. Douglas County is in the southwest portion, and we're expecting about 6% growth there. All areas are expected to grow, so nobody's going negative over the 10-year period. The Portland area and the Bend area are expected to experience more rapid growth than other areas. And that's just been going on for years, and that's expected to continue at least going into a portion of the 10-year period. Next. For Southwest Oregon, these are this is expected growth by industry. The fastest industry and one adding the most jobs is private healthcare and social assistance. The aging of the population just continues to put demand for health services. So we're expecting a lot of jobs to be created there. Construction is next. We've been before the pandemic and, right on through, really, we've been seeing strong growth in construction. We're expecting that to continue. Housing inventories in Oregon remain relatively low. And we, even with the fires and the pandemic, we would expect to see some population growth also going forward. Professional and business services is just a very large industry that has a little above average growth. The professional portion of that is like engineering, architecture, accounting, law firms is the part that's expected to grow more rapidly there. Leisure and hospitality, another very large industry with above average growth, so it adds a lot of jobs. As we go down, manufacturing, relatively slow growth going into the future. Natural resources and mining, that's logging mostly in Southwest Oregon, expected to grow very slowly. And that's how it's been going for decades now. So information is negative. For information, it's made up of two major components. There's software publishing and print publishing. If you're in an area where software publishing dominates the information industry, you're going to have positive growth over the 10-year period. In Southwest Oregon, it's largely print publishing. People continue to get their information electronically. So we're expecting print publication to continue a slow decline, not as rapidly as in the past, but we're expecting to see some small job loss in the information sector because of print publishing. Next. Okay, so all industries create opportunity through replacement openings. So what's going on with this graph is the gold bars out to near the left axis. Those are the growth numbers from the previous graph. So those are growth openings. The replacement openings are in blue, and replacement openings can be created for several reasons. There are exits, and that's largely retirements and maybe a little death when people actually, leave the labor force and create a replacement opening in an occupation. And then there are transfers, and that's where people change occupations either through advancement or changing careers. For instance, a young person might be working in a restaurant until they get their degree, their college degree, and become an accountant. So they create a replacement opening by changing occupations. Either way, especially with the elevated retirements and moderate growth going into the future, there's a lot of opportunity available for people who get the right education and training. There's a lot of opportunity going forward. Next. I will entertain questions. I want to point out our subscription service. It's the best way to get our data and publications. If you go out to the website, you'll fill out a form for the areas and the types of publications and data you want to receive. And the day that that data or publication is published, you'll get a link to it in an email. So if there are any questions, I guess we can take a look at those.
Yeah, so one of the questions that we had was regarding the, I guess, the level of detail that you have on people leaving the workforce. So do we have an idea of how many people are staying home to take care of kids because of the at-home schooling, or left the job market because they chose to retire? Now just is maybe the time to do it?
Not an exact count. At the state level, there's a graph, there's a curve, and it's called the Beveridge curve. It's named after a person, an economist, a statistician. Some people call it the Beveridge curve, but it's the Beveridge curve, and it shows efficiency of the unemployed getting a job. And the latest recession shows that workers are very inefficient at getting a job. So the unemployment rate is high. There's a lot of unemployed, but they're not getting back into the labor force. And, there are several reasons for that. I pointed out that that a lot of the layoffs are considered temporary. So people are staying at home, waiting for that temporary job to come back. But as you said, there are several reasons to stay home during a pandemic. One of them is childcare. Kids aren't back in school. Childcare places are running at lower levels because they have to practice social distancing. And then if there's a case of COVID at your childcare, those kids are going to be home for 2 weeks. They're going to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. So childcare is a big issue. And so we're seeing a lot of people stay home, even though unemployment rates are high. As Robert said before, we have middle-class people going into poverty, not necessarily because they couldn't find any job, but and that's the case in some cases, but these other factors would cause you to, try and stay home and not get out in the public and take that job. But yeah, no, we don't have like exact numbers. We do know the number of unemployed, and we do know that, some of the reasons are that they're temporarily unemployed, but also childcare and just, not wanting to get sick are big reasons people are not going back into the labor force right now.
Okay, gotcha. And then how do you guys track the job losses? As far as where do you get that?
Oh, yeah, that's from the current population survey, and that is where all the numbers for the unemployment rate, the number of unemployed. It's a household survey. At the statewide level and the national level, that's what goes into the unemployment rate. And in Oregon, I believe that it's around 1,000 households are surveyed every month. At the local level for Douglas County, we include unemployment statistics. The number of people that apply for benefits, the number of people receiving benefits are also factored in to the household survey to get an idea of the number of unemployed. And they answer these questions, is this are you under temporary unemployment? Or are you temporarily unemployed? Do you have an employer that says they will take you back? And actually, if you do have an employer that says they're going to take you back, you don't have to look for work, or you don't have to take a job if you're offered one. If you're on permanent unemployment, you do have to look for work, and you do have to take work if it's offered to you. So there's a pretty big difference there. And as I pointed out before, there's a big difference between kind of your normal structural recession, like the Great Recession, and then this one that's caused by a sociological shock.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And then the last question that we have, I think I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to let you answer it because you are the expert. We have a question about the additional $300 in federal unemployment. Well, I guess it wasn't actually unemployment insurance, but in money available to those who were on unemployment, as far as whether that is still in effect or not.
You know, I think most of that has run out. I believe that, and actually, if you know the answer, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that ended in late June or July, and that's running out right now.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. Is that the additional amount that they had put through had been expended by the state at this point.
Yeah. Yes.
So, okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate your time today. Now, before we get to our third presenter, we're going to take a go offline for about 10 minutes. So stay connected. If you are connected, we'll just I'll have a holding screen on for 10 minutes for people to take a break and whatnot, and we'll be back at 10:25. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you back here in 10. All right, welcome back, everybody. And let me go ahead and give everybody a second to come back. All right, and so our final presenter this morning, John Horvich with DHM Research. Mr. Horvich is Director of Client Relations and Political Research at DHM. In his decade with the firm, John has wedded his passion for community-based politics with his expertise in opinion research. He manages complex projects for the firm, is an experienced focus group moderator, and serves as DHM's political commentator. While he is particularly dedicated to Oregon's political life, John has worked on projects across the country. His areas of interest include electoral politics, healthcare, education, land use planning, natural resource use, energy and utilities, transportation, and taxation. John holds a degree in sociology from the University of Minnesota. He has since found a second home in Portland and has devoted himself to furthering a culture of civic engagement in Oregon. He recently served as president of the City Club of Portland and remains an active member in the organization. John is an avid traveler and runner and can frequently be found on his way to meeting his annual goal of running in all 36 of Oregon's counties. He'll have to let us know if he's checked Douglas County off that list yet. Please welcome John Horvich. And
there we go. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And I have got Douglas County off the calendar for 2020. Always one of my favorite stops. All right. Can you, Alan, allow me to screen share?
Absolutely. Let me get that set. And sorry, just one.
There we go.
There we go.
Looks like we got it. All right. Thanks so much. I am going to show some slides because I'm a pollster and pollsters show numbers and charts. So I'll be doing that. And if Alan or someone can just chime in, let me know that you see this, and then we'll get rolling.
Yep, looks good.
All right, everybody, thanks so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm John Horvich with DHM Research. We're an independent, nonpartisan public opinion and policy firm. It means I'm a pollster. We work in the Pacific Northwest primarily. We do some projects across the country, particularly around transportation. But a lot of my work is here focused in Oregon. Of course, that means we do a lot of survey research. Definitely one of those shops that call folks up right around dinner time, usually when they don't want to be pestered, but start asking some questions about this, that, and the other. I do a lot of qualitative research too. And so pre-COVID days, I spent a lot of my time traveling across the state, sitting down at the table with folks, asking them about issues in their community and the state. Of course, now in COVID, we've transitioned to doing some of those online, although I'm anxious to be able to get back on the road and meeting people face to face. What I'm planning to do today is to do a little election debrief with really sort of a focus on how the economy shaped the election, or maybe in some ways where it had a pretty muted effect. So that's my goal. I have sort of three main things I want to talk about. A quick look at the presidential election. There's tons of information out there in the world, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a couple points that I want to share, and then really kind of focus on the economy and the election. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about some just other notable election results that I think are important to be paying attention to, that speak to broader trends in the electorate and some important policy movements as well that I think are important to highlight. So that's the goal, and then I'll save time for Q&A. All right, let's talk elections, particularly presidential elections, and a little about some voting trends. And so first here, just to ground ourselves, these are probably numbers that look familiar to you, but on the left here are the percentages that Trump got in the 2016 and 2020 elections. The light color is the 2016, the dark is 2020. So Trump improved 1 percentage point from 2016 to 2020, at least as the results sit right now. There are a few more votes to count. But on the right, Biden improved 6 percentage points upon Clinton. So we went from a 12-point gap in 2012 to about a 17-point gap here in 2020. And really what happened between the 2 years, well, I suppose there's many things that happened, but just looking at the numbers, in 2016, there a higher percentage of third-party votes. And there were no, although there were third-party candidates on the ballot, none of them with the sort of prominence that Jill Stein or Gary Johnson had 4 years ago. And the predominant number of folks who voted for a third party this time went to Biden this time. Of course, the electorate was bigger in 2020 as well, with more people turning out this year than they did 4 years ago. And I'll show a little bit about that later. So there's some new voters too, and those new voters and third party voters really did move towards Biden in 2020, and that's the difference between the two cycles. But we go closer to home. Here are the margins, a Republican presidential vote margin in Douglas County. So you can see from 2000 to 2020, the margin was a little bit lower during the Obama years, just 20 percentage points difference. So this is, by the way, to slow down a little bit, in say 2008, Obama beat McCain in Douglas County by 20 percentage points, would be the way to read this chart. And so this Obama years, the Democrats did marginally better in Douglas County. And then in 2016 and 2020, Trump won, or was winning, I should say, in 2020, the county by 38 percentage points. So there was a little bit of a decrease in 2008 and 2012, kind of back to where we were before, maybe a tick or two higher. And that's important. That's your community. But I do want to highlight Washington County, and there's a reason for it. So here are the Democratic presidential vote margins in Washington County. Washington County, of course, is just west of Multnomah County, Hillsborough, Beaverton area, Forest Grove. It's the second largest county in the state. If you add up Multnomah County plus Washington County, you're about a third of the voters in the state. And Washington County used to be a competitive area of the state. So in 2000, Al Gore beat George W. Bush by just 2 percentage points. And then in 2004, Kerry beat Bush by 6. 2008, Obama won by 22, then 17 in 2012, and then 26 in 2016, and 35 percentage points in 2020. So the second largest county in the state has become not just blue, but dark blue. And the multiple reasons for that, but some key things about Washington County are that it's relatively young. Its median age is lower than the median age in the state. It's diverse. It has one of the most diverse non-white populations in the state, although not the highest, but one of the highest. And it's well educated. It has, I think, the second highest level of college degrees in the state. And so young populations, diverse populations, and educated populations are all groups that are moving towards the Democrats. I say this because it's an interesting trend, but it also has, important influence on statewide politics. So in Oregon, since 2002, Democrats have won 29 of 31 statewide races. So those are presidential races, Senate races, gubernatorial races, Secretary of Treasurer, all those races. And so, this trend predates, obviously, the growing Democratic sort of parts of the suburban areas of the Portland metro area. We sort of think how difficult it is for Republicans to win statewide, even before these trends really picked up, and how much more difficult it will be going forward. And this election, Democrats swept the statewide races. They lost a little bit in the state legislature. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But just the overwhelming challenge that faces the Republican Party in Oregon right now is really typified by this trend and what's happening in the suburban areas of the Portland metro area. So even though some of the rural areas are becoming even deeper red or are maintaining their sort of redness, the metro areas are becoming bluer. All right, so that's just a little bit about the state, not a whole lot, or this presidential race, but now let's sort of dig into the direction of the state and how people are feeling about the economy. So one of the questions that pollsters love to ask, and we do at DHM, is this right direction, wrong track question. So is Oregon headed in the right direction, or are things off on the wrong track? And these are the trend. This is the trend line from DHM surveys from 2001 to 2020. These are all from the late summer or fall of every year. And so we ask it more than once a year, but just for comparable data points, particularly in election years, I've just pulled the fall numbers for us. And I like this chart because in the 2001 number, that survey was conducted just the week before September 11th. So it's that first week of September. And it's 66 percentage points said that the state was heading in the right direction at the time. We really can sort of see that as their ceiling, or at least a potential ceiling. We've been there before. And then in 2002, we're heading to recession, talk of war, terrorism, all those things. That right direction number falls to 21%. And that's been our floor for the last couple of decades. It's bounced around a little bit since then. It was a little bit lower during the Great Recession, picked up a little bit after. And then we're in, as of October, so this is just from a couple weeks ago, we were at 44%, which is just about the average for the 2-decade period. However, this overall trend line, although there's some movement, particularly in the early 2000s, it really does mask a big fundamental change that's happening below the surface, and that's the division by partisanship. So here are these same data, just broken out by Democrats and Republicans. So from 2001 until 2008, the blue line here represent the right direction percentage points among Democrats. Same surveys as the previous slide. The red lines represent the right direction percentages for Republicans. There was a spread in 2006, 2007 that narrowed again in 2008. But if you look at this period from 2001 to 2008, there was on average a 9 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans. 9 percentage points. From 2009 through this fall, that gap has grown to about 44 percentage points. Democrats have become consistently positive about the direction of the state, and Republicans have become consistently very negative. So just a really tremendous change. You can really see that it's around 2009 where that gap exists or begins. Of course, two major things are happening then, at least two, but we started into the Great Recession and Barack Obama became president, and those factors I think both play an important role in so changing the trajectory of these two lines and then affirming them in place. But it's really remarkable. Partisanship is not just something that happens in Washington, D.C., it's here at home as well. And more I see it not just at the state level, but at the local municipal level too. It really is becoming part of our day-to-day lives and politics. It is making governance more difficult. So more specifically about the economy, got pretty typical questions that DHM and others ask, but one is just to rate the current conditions of Oregon's economy. So the dark green here would be very good. The lighter green would be good. The pale red is only fair, and then the dark red is poor. These are from September, so they're about 6 weeks old at this point. But I doubt things have changed very much since then. And you can see at the time that 78% of Oregonians rated the state's economy as only fair or poor. Now, historically, that's a very, very low number. And concerningly, and it was a bit as a surprise to me when we saw the data come in. We also asked, well, are things getting better? Are they getting worse, or are they staying the same? So the getting better here is the green slice of the right-hand pie. The getting worse is the red, and then the staying about the same is yellow, don't know is gray. So 46% said it's getting worse. Just about 9% said that it's getting better. So about 5 times as many Oregonians as of about 6 weeks ago said the economy was getting worse than better. And the reason that was a surprise to me is that I think on some objective conditions that the economy has improved. And you've had some other folks speak, so maybe they contradict that or maybe they affirm that. But unemployment has been dropping. The stock market's held up pretty well. There's been ups and downs, of course, in it, but held up fairly well. So the fact that 5 times more think that things are getting worse than better is telling. However, our voters, or Oregonians, voters, both everybody and specifically voters have been giving us really mixed messages about the economy. Let me give you another way to think about this. A question that we started asking about a decade ago on surveys regularly is asking people about how worried they are about their financial situations. And the reason we started doing this is because really starting about 2008, 2009, we started to see, not just us, but in national surveys, a growing partisan divide in how people answered questions about the state of the economy generally. And so when Democrats were in power, Democrats decided we're rating the economy better, Republicans in power. Republicans are rating the economy better. That's not totally inconsistent with perhaps facts on the ground, but it wasn't something that was true with the question in previous decades. Where you tend to see less of a difference in partisanship is when you ask people how to reflect on their personal circumstances rather than, globally or broadly. And because of that, we started supplementing our economic questions with this personal question. And so here is a trend line of Oregonians who are saying that they were very or somewhat worried about their personal financial situations. They could have also said not to or not at all. And you can see that worry peaked in 2012. 69% of Oregonians at the time said that they were very or somewhat worried about their personal financial situations. And then it fell slowly, but it fell throughout the decade with a little blip there in 2018, but it was down to 50 percentage point in 2019. That was in December of 2019. And I think there's a couple ways to interpret these data that would both be accurate, but they are different. One interpretation is that between 2012 and 2019, we went from 69% to 50% worried. And so a 19 percentage point drop. That means hundreds of thousands of Oregonians and families were less worried about their finances at the end of the decade than the start of the decade. And that's really meaningful. Think of how much stress was reduced for folks by having that drop. On the other hand, even at the end of 2019, when unemployment was at near record lows, half of Oregonians were worried. And that's something for us to reflect upon and be concerned about. So at the start of COVID, we began asking this question not once a year, but about once every month or so. And I was not surprised at all to see worry jump at the start of COVID, but I was to see what happened, surprised to see what happened afterwards. So here on the right side are percentage of Oregonians answering the same question who say that they're very or somewhat worried about their personal financial situation from March, and that March survey was after the stay-at-home orders were put in place I think March 21st, so it was the tail end of March. And then up until October, that October survey was just about 3 weeks ago. So you can see that concern did spike at the early days of COVID as job losses were happening, businesses were closing, but then it fell. In fact, by June through September, it's actually a tick lower than it was in late 2019, despite the fact that unemployment was still high, despite the fact that many businesses have closed or hadn't reopened yet. It did jump up 4 percentage points in October, and that could just be, noise, statistical noise, but it could be the beginning of a trend too. Your last speaker was mentioning that the $300 additional payment has ended. Certainly the $600 payments that were happening before have ended. And so we'll see where that trend line goes from here. But it really does matter in how I think about the election and the outcomes of the election, both nationally and here in Oregon. Because even though people have lost jobs, businesses have closed, people were telling us that their personal financial concerns were less. And I think a big part of that reason is that we just gave people a lot of money, and then they didn't have very many places to spend it. So these data are national data, and then the chart comes from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. So they took the national data and put in a nice chart for us. Looking at personal income from January through September and personal consumption expenditures. And you can see personal income actually spiked in April. Of course, that's when the first round of stimulus money came through, the $600 per week enhanced federal insurance benefit, plus the $1,200, et cetera. And then the blue line on the lower part of this chart says that people just stopped spending money. And so bank accounts, people were more flush with cash, through the summer in September and then heading into the election. And so how the economy was talked about during the election was a bit confusing, because on the one hand, Democrats were saying it's the worst economy since the Great Depression, that the president had mismanaged the economy. On the other hand, voters had more money in their pockets than they had before the pandemic arrived. And so it's a bit confusing how it went in voters' minds. Here is sort of another data point to help us think through this. Gallup has been asking regularly, about once a month in their national surveys, going back a long period, what is the most important problem facing the country? It's asked open-ended, so people can say anything that they want. They could say terrorism, they could say racism, they could say policing, or whatever might be the issue today. And then this chart shows you all the mentions of the economy. So anything from jobs to economic growth to the unemployment rate to whatever it might be, any economic comments are represented in this green line. And you can see that economics comments peaked as problems facing the country in about 2009, when 86% of Americans said something with the economy was the most important problem. And that fell and fell and fell and fell and fell, but it didn't spike during COVID. And I think that's really surprising to people, that despite the job losses, that Americans weren't saying that the economy is the most important problem. Again, we gave people money. I don't want to minimize any difficulties that people are experiencing, but it just didn't show up in the data. And so in October, just 14% of Oregonians, or excuse me, I keep saying Oregonians, Americans, said that the economic worries or problems were the country's biggest issue. And so I interpret that in part as the president was getting pretty good marks on his economic management, that Americans disassociated the state of the economy from political leadership, kind of blaming it on the virus rather than blaming it on leadership. And it just wasn't the top of mind issue for voters as they were deciding how to cast the ballots, whether it's for president or a local funding measure. This is just gives us some more historical data. So this is the percentage of Oregonians who said that the economy was the most important, excuse me, most important issue facing the country during years when there was a presidential incumbent on the ballot. And so you can see, just for example, in 1992, that's when Bill Clinton said it's economy stupid. 69% of Americans said the economy was the biggest problem facing the country, but it was just 14% in 2020. So 2020 really was a remarkable year in light of how voters were thinking about the economy. Even though there was lots of job losses, it wasn't the same as before. In fact, it's less concern than before. Another interesting data point, this is also from Gallup. Not every election cycle, but several election cycles, they've been asking Americans if they're better off than they were 4 years ago. So they asked it for Reagan in '84, Bush 1 in '92, Bush 2, 2004, Obama 2012, and then Trump in 2020. And you can see that more than half of Americans said that they're better off than they were 4 years ago. That's higher than any previous time that they've asked this question. Now, this question isn't specific to the economy, but I think it's often interpreted with an economic lens. Are you better off than 4 years ago, meaning you're more financially secure, you have more savings, you have more economic opportunity. There could be other factors as well. But more Americans said that they're better off 4 years ago now than in previous elections in the last 4 decades. So what was on voters' minds as they went to go vote if it wasn't the economy, or at least it wasn't the economy so much? So the rest of those survey answers to that question, most important problem, are number one, COVID. So 30% of Americans in October said that COVID was the biggest problem facing the country, and then 23% said poor leadership. So and Americans overwhelmingly disapproved of how the president had been managing COVID. It's really, really clear. And then poor leadership is really a reflection on the president as well. It's not only the president, some of that could be Congress, some of it could be your governor, but certainly the president was a big part of that. So this was an election primarily about a referendum on President Trump and his management of COVID, much more than Americans' feelings about the economy. You can see where the economy fits in there, and then some of the issues that fall below it, like race relations, crime, unifying the country, healthcare, the courts. The courts is interesting to be so low after there was just a Supreme Court nomination and placement of Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. And so that's nationally. What about Oregon? So we asked the same question in a DHM survey in October. What's the most important problem facing Oregon today? And Oregonians said the biggest problems in the state were the protests that have been going on, obviously primarily in Portland. But you can't get to 19% unless you have lots of folks outside of Portland saying that that's the biggest problem. So plenty of voters, say in Bend or Roseburg, were telling us the protests were the biggest problem, even if they weren't impactful in their own communities. 18% said COVID, 14% said the environment. I will say that we asked this question in September as well. And in September, environmental mentions were only 2 or 3%. Remember, this October survey occurred after the fires. And so a lot of these environment comments are really about wildfires. I expect that the environment will return to a 2 or 3 percentage point answer in the months ahead, because that's historically where it's been. And once a big environmental moment passes us, that will decline. So nationally, it was about COVID. It was about President Trump. The big issues here in Oregon were protests, COVID, the environment, but that's really, I think, temporary. Again, you can see the economy just at 9% here in Oregon just wasn't a major factor in how people were thinking about the election. So why is this important? Well, I think one of the big, interesting things for me is that local funding measures have just done really well in 2020. So in the May primary across the state, there were 48 local funding measures. It's everything from big bond measures, maybe in the Portland metro area, to small little levies at a rural transportation district. So if you count them all up, there were 48, and 36 of them passed and just 12 failed. So May, it was concerns about the economy were still higher, quite high, falling, but higher than they were later in the summer. And voters overwhelmingly said yes to increase their taxes locally. And then in November, there were 68 funding measures on the ballot. Right now, 52 of them are passing, just 16 are failing. Now, there's some big notable ones that have failed, like the Metro Transportation Measure up in the Portland metro area. Another big one, like in Clackamas County, a children's levy. Some big ticket ones did fail. But overwhelmingly, May and November were very positive. It was a good time to put something on the ballot and get it passed. And I think it's a reflection. The fact that so many people said yes was in part because they had felt like they were economically secure enough to say yes to higher taxes. There was very few things in Douglas County, just a couple marijuana taxes in Reedsport and Winston. They both passed overwhelmingly. Marijuana taxes always pass overwhelmingly. I don't think any have ever failed here in the state. There's probably very few communities left to pass them, but the two on the ballot in Douglas County did pass. Well, one other I'm not sure how profile it felt like to you guys down in Roseburg, but you weren't alone. There were 4 of these measures across the state at the county level to have the commissioners discuss moving the border, or I'm not exactly sure I could describe them very well, but these Idaho border measures, 2 of them passed and 2 of them failed. The yes vote was the smallest in Douglas County, 43% yes to 57% no. Very, very narrowly failing in Walla Walla County, and in Jefferson and Union, narrowly passing. For whatever that's worth to you, these seem to be quite divisive ideas, at least at the ballot. I don't know, not being in Douglas County, if they're like that on the ground. But 2 passed, 2 failed, and all pretty much divided their communities. All right, and that's going to finish up by just some other notable election results that I think are worth paying attention to. One is turnout. So these are the turnout numbers from 2000 to 2020. The yellow line is of registered voters, and then the green line is of eligible voters. So an eligible voter is anybody who's over 18, a citizen, not a felon. And a registered voter is someone who's registered. And what's important about this, if you can see my cursor, is that from 2012 to 2016, it's where you see the change. And in 2016, that's where motor voter was implemented. So we've registered a lot more people since 2012, particularly a big jump heading in 2016, but even more in 2020. So in 2012, about 70% of Oregonians were registered to vote, or eligible Oregonians were registered to vote. Now it's about 91 or 92%. And so even though this yellow line, percent of turnout among registered voters, hasn't changed that much, in fact, it's even down a little bit since 2004 or 2008. The green line, the turnout among eligible voters, is up considerably, up 13 percentage points since 2012. So motor voters worked. It really is getting more people registered. It really is getting people to the ballots. And so it is working as intended. So that's one finding I think is interesting. The other is that, now I know this is in the Portland metro area, but I do think it's really important to consider for communities across the state. The Portland metro area is now 2 for 2 on local income taxes. So in the May primary, the Metro Regional Government put on the ballot and it passed a local income tax to fund homeless services. And then in November, Multnomah County put an income tax to fund universal preschool, or as they call it, a pure preschool for all. And that passed convincingly as well. As Oregon continues to struggle with this property tax system, as somebody who regularly works with local governments around asking voters to increase property taxes at the ballot, I know the limitations on it. The limitations with the permanent rates, the limitations on the caps that they can have at the local government and school levels, the timeline restrictions with levies. Income taxes, at least right now, don't have those restrictions, right? There's no constitutional limit on how high they could be. There's no constitutional limit on how long they can be. There's no constitutional limit on permanent rates. And then in Portland, at least in the metro area, they're experimenting with putting these on the ballot. And I know Portland is more tax friendly than other parts of the state, but these are passing convincingly. And I really do wonder whether other local communities are going to be looking at these outcomes and say, boy, maybe we need to be supplementing our property tax system with another form of taxation. And there is some success for income taxes in the Portland metro area. So I do really think that these taxes on homeless services and for universal preschool may be less important for what they fund than how they fund it. And it really is, I think, something for you in Douglas County and Roseburg to be paying attention to. The other is that Central Oregon is becoming blue. So Deschutes County voted for a Democratic president for the first time since 1992. Sherry Helt there in the Bend, Representative Sherry Helt in the Bend district got walloped. She was the Republican there. Tim Knoop barely hung on to his seat. He's the state senator from the Deschutes County area. So these are registration numbers in Deschutes County. These are just Democrats and Republicans. I took up the non-affiliated, but from 2002 to 2020, and you can see the clear trend line. One is just a lot more voters in Central Oregon than there was in the past, but the Democrats are surpassing Republicans. So Central Oregon could be another sort of base of support for Democrats. And that's a real change from the past. So Central Oregon, the Bend area, Deschutes County really becoming more blue. I'd say Wasco County, it's a smaller county, but another that's trending blue. Hood River is already blue. But the coast is becoming more red. The Democrats lost 3 legislative seats on the coast. So 2 House seats and a Senate seat. And these are just for Coos County. I took that out there, but it is for Coos County. These are the Coos County numbers. And you can see Coos County really started in 2014, I mean, it went from a blue county to a red county, and it's really sharply. The Southern Oregon coast in particular is becoming red, becoming redder. And I think you can sort of see where the demographic and political trends are in the state, with Central Oregon becoming bluer and the coast becoming redder. There are some key trends to be watching out for in the future. Oops. And then my last one is that this is a little tricky to describe, but I think it's really interesting and important. So let me first try to describe what these numbers mean. In 2020, right now, Joe Biden is leading Donald Trump in Multnomah County by 61 percentage points. And in Lake County, President Trump is leading Joe Biden by 61 percentage points. So in both those counties, there's a 61 percentage point gap between the 2 candidates. So if we did that for every county and then find the median, what is the sort of the typical county, how much of a difference there is there between a Democrat and a Republican in the presidential race? This is what these charts, these bars are going to represent. And so in 1992, the median difference between Democrat and Republican in the presidential race across all the counties in Oregon was 6 percentage points. So the typical county in Oregon, 2002, there's a 6 percentage point difference in the presidential outcome. Now watch what happens. In 1996, it goes to 12 percentage points. 2020, 2004, 20, 2008, 22, 2012, 24 percentage points, 2016, 30 percentage points, and 2020, it's 33 percentage points. We've become more partisan. You saw that earlier with the right direction, wrong track numbers, and our counties are going different directions. Our blue counties are becoming bluer. Our red counties are becoming redder. This is a trend that exists nationally as well, so Oregon is not an outlier in this at all. But as we think about where we head as a state, how we work together as a state, these are some, I think, real trend lines to keep in mind. And I'm supposed to challenge all of ourselves, how we will work together to solve collective problems when we seem to be moving in different directions. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll use whatever time left to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you very much, John. Okay, so we have a question, and this one is, let No, basically it's, again, talking about pollsters and, the results during the last election not necessarily matching up to the end result. And they're suggesting that that they had heard that a European firm was asking people who their friends were voting for and got more accurate answers. And the question is whether or not that is something that really works, and whether or not people are more forthright saying what people they know are going to do rather than who they're going to vote for, maybe getting more honest answers that way.
Right, so there's a couple questions embedded here. I'm going to try to tackle them one at a time. First, there will be a lot of analysis with the polls in 2020 as there was in 2016. I'm a little bit hesitant to sort of give a deep analysis of them now, because not only are a lot more votes left to be counted, and we don't know yet how accurate the polls were or not, but a lot of the theories I've seen so far about why they may have been right or where they were wrong and reasons why, I'm not sure they're going to hold up once more votes are counted, but in particular, I'm not sure if they make sense across multiple areas. For example, the polling looks particularly bad in Wisconsin, but looks pretty good in Minnesota. So whatever theory you're going to have, I think, is going to need to be able to explain those two states, which is not to say that there won't be good answers. It's just, I think I need to see a lot more data before I feel like I have a good answer. The question about asking how your friends are going to vote, that's an interesting one. There is good research that predates this election that can be a more accurate predictor. The theory is a little bit different than the question suggests. It's not about whether people are shy or not being truthful about who they're going to vote for, but they are increasing their sample size, so to speak. So when you're speaking for more people, you're getting a broader sort of perspective of what the electorate might be. The first part, like perhaps people are, I don't really think this is the explanation, but people aren't being honest with their answer, but being honest on what other people are thinking. That's a possibility. But I think that those sorts of data points should be investigated by pollsters and researchers to see if that is helpful in polling going forward. So I'm glad that question was asked. It wasn't original to that survey, but most pollsters aren't asking it. So it will help us understand how polls did this year.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. All right. And it looks like those are all the questions that I have. So thank you very much for answering that. And again, thank you to you and to all of our presenters for being with us today. We do hope that the information that was shared was helpful and will guide your business in the coming year as we will face so many unknowns. I do want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors today again, because without you, this program would not be possible. So thank you to Adcox Heating Center, Bowers Industrial Incorporated, Gordon Wood Insurance, Lone Rock Resources, Roseburg Forest Products, and Umpqua Bank. Just a couple of quick reminders before we leave. We hope to see a number of you virtually at our final membership meeting program of the year this coming Monday on November 16th, where we will learn about what to expect in 2021 from the Oregon State Legislature and the U.S. Congress. Please also mark your calendars for March 18th, 2021. Yes, that's a ways ahead, but yeah, March 18th, 2021. This is the date that the Chamber has set aside for its annual celebration of businesses, awards presentations, and annual membership meeting. We are hoping our program and events will be in person. We're currently planning 3 events on that day: a breakfast, a lunch, and a casual dinner. 1, to provide our members with an experience that meets their time and financial needs, and 2, if we still have restrictions in place, we'll be able to get together in smaller groups and maintain whatever physical distancing mandate is required. So look for more detailed information about that early next year. This also means the Chamber is currently accepting nominations for our Businesses of the Year, male and female First Citizen honors, and other recognitions. The nomination forms are on the Chamber website, and they are also online in the Chamber's November-December Business Perspectives newsletter. If you have any challenges finding those nomination forms, please call or email Debbie at the Chamber, and she'll get them to you. Finally, we all know how hard all of our local businesses have been hit in 2020. So just as a reminder, a plea, as we enter the busy holiday season, please shop local, dine local, drink local, play local. Our local businesses' very survival and the lifeblood of this community depends on all of us keeping our dollars here this holiday season and beyond. Thank you again to our presenters, sponsors, and our virtual attendees for joining us today. Everybody, have a great day. Thanks a lot.